So thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here and really honored to have been asked to provide this presentation on implementing and supporting trauma-informed courts. I think this topic is really important and specifically to our communities, really relevant to the work that we do, both courts and other parts of the criminal legal system. So I wanted to take a minute during the tech introduction portion where I was working with TLPI. They let me know of a loss to the community and a loss of someone's life that was fairly recent. And it really struck me how relevant this is to our conversation. And even just hearing the news, even though I wasn't close to this person, but knowing people who are close and then hearing about different things, it really resonated in me how trauma kind of hits us when we least expect it, and really telling us that life is um, uh, precious and also super fragile. And so I wanted to take a minute to just feel that gratitude for the life and the opportunity that I have today, as well as I hope all of you coming from your different paths and experiences. And if you had recent loss or had recent trauma, take a minute, breathe. Um, and I hope that you take care of yourself and take care of the folks that you love and care closely to you. But anyway, I felt the need to kind of get that off my chest before I dive into a conversation about trauma-informed practices. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about who I am. I'm Dr. Violet Cloud. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my background is both in the law as well as in clinical psychology. So I received both my JD and my PhD at the University of New Mexico. And so I work in this space pretty exclusively where that overlap of how the legal system works, process, all the confusion and complications that come with how the legal system works. But then I'm also really dedicated and interested in understanding our psychology, how we can maximize health and wellness, and how we can understand both of these systems together. So I do have that background. I've also done some research with adapting treatments for Native American individuals who have substance use issues or disorders. And so I am experienced in that space as well. And my other research is based in mental health courts. So you can see some of that. But I do have background in this space. I will state, though, that I've never practiced in a treatment court as an attorney. And so I will acknowledge that limitation to my understanding. I do hope now that we can go into what we're going to learn today. I hope there's some learning opportunities here, not just for you all, but also for me. So I had in the announcement, if you saw it, quite pretty aspirational objectives for what we might learn in this conversation. But really by the end, I hope that you walk away with a better understanding of trauma and what we mean when we say trauma informed. I think this is kind of a hot item topic in a lot of spaces right now. And I think sometimes it's important to slow down and really think about, well, what is it that we're talking about? Why is it important? And how do we do it in a way that really gets to what it is that we're trying to get to? So I hope that's something that we'll come away from today with. So with that in mind, I have quite a few things that I want to cover. Um, I want to get an understanding of trauma. We'll talk about some definitions, where they come from, and what definition we're going to run with. Also, looking at trauma-informed frameworks, you'll see that as I said, it's a hot button topic. And so the word trauma-informed gets attached to so many different words. So we want to understand that a bit more. And then really explore why and maybe should courts be trauma informed, and if they even can do it ethically. I want to explore that conversation. And then after having that conversation about why it might be challenging, why there might be views about implementing trauma informed practices, keep it doable, accessible, and have it loop all back into the way that we understand trauma and the frameworks and how they apply. And then finally, there's going to be a lot of information. I'm going to warn you right now that the slides are pretty barren. I don't want you to be distracted by a lot of like numbers or diagrams or anything like that. So don't worry about taking notes. Don't worry about even looking at the slides. This is really just going to provide information, really my perspective on how we can do better in the criminal legal system of implementing trauma-informed practices. But at the end, I do have a pretty comprehensive list of resources that I might reference over the course of the conversation. I also have pretty extensive presenter notes that I am totally happy with sharing. So you don't need to take notes as to what I'm saying. I am totally happy to share how the way that I've organized this information for myself, and it's very close, like a script or an outline that you might be able to use if you wanted to refresh your memory about what I talked about today. And then once we get through the resources, there will be substantial time for discussion. So we'll just dive right into it. So understanding trauma really starts with defining the word trauma. And I want to start first by looking at the definition that comes from the American Psychological Association. So according to the American Psychological Association, or APA, there's two types of trauma, physical or psychological. And the psychological definition is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings, intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on the person's attitudes, behaviors, and other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events might be those that are caused by human behavior, so such as rape, war, or industrial accidents, as well as nature, earthquakes, or global pandemic. And these events often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. Similarly, the definition for physical trauma from the APA is any serious physical injury, such as widespread burn or a blow to the head. So you can see from the APA, they're breaking it down to really what the event is or what the instance of trauma is, and it could be emotional or it could be physical. And I want to expand that, or not necessarily contrast it, but look then to the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration definition, SAMHSA, and their definition is more about the results or the effects. They say trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So you can see that SAMHSA's definition not only combines the physical and psychological elements from the APA definition, but it also expands to incorporate this understanding of the effect that it really impacts a person's social, emotional, spiritual well-being, as well as those functional aspects that a clinician might be interested in. So a little bit more talking about why the differences are needed, right? So we understand why we had to shift this more robust or all-encompassing holistic definition. So for the clinician or the psychologist, having a really precise definition of trauma is useful because they're helpful to specifying what types of trauma have occurred, which might pertain to a diagnosis or a particular treatment method or modality. And so that's why you need that specificity. In contrast, using SAMHSA's broader definition really allows us to wrap together that a traumatic event can affect both physical and psychological, as well as all these other spaces of human existence, such as social, emotional, and spiritual domains. And so when we're talking, or when I'm talking about trauma-informed and trauma-informed practices, I'm really thinking about that holistic term and that holistic definition of trauma. And this might be something that is useful to clarify when you're working in your courts, because definitions and operational definitions are really important, especially whenever you're bridging multiple fields of practice or professionals together. So if you have psychologists or clinicians that are part of your treatment court, you might want to have a conversation about what is meant when the team is talking about trauma, so that you are really clear about the limits and the scope of that. All right, so now let's talk then, if we think about how Sams's definition brings us to integrating physical and emotional aspects, we can now be signaled to also think about how it affects, or the effects, the symptoms, what it looks like when we see someone responding or showing that they have trauma history. So we can understand the effects of trauma clinically. For example, when we think from the clinician or the psychologist perspective, we know that there's categories and known effects or known symptoms. So those might be exhaustion, confusion, sadness, anxiety, agitation, numbness, dissociation, physical arousal, blunted affect. These are a range of symptoms that might be described in like a clinician's notes. But what does this really look like if we're in the courtroom? How can we recognize the effects of trauma in these spaces? So starting first with exhaustion. So we might be recognizing or recognizing that a person is tired, but did we do that next step of thinking, wait, why are they tired? So tired or exhaustion might have this later impact of individuals not being able to participate effectively in the proceedings of the court or respond to answers. Similarly, confusion is another symptom. They might be having a difficulty tracking the conversation, responding to questions. So we can see how these symptoms, these clinical symptoms, might roll out in a court environment. But what are we supposed to do, right? So exhaustion, you might be able to see that a person is tired and maybe ask them, did you get enough sleep last night? That might be something that you bring into the conversation. But I'm going to slow down and not go too much into examples of how we might respond to that. I just really want to show you what the effects of trauma might be, or the symptoms of trauma might be. So more severe symptoms or responses could be this prolonged distress, an individual really unable to self-regulate, or severe dissociation. This, for example, defendant or witness might have episodes where they're not aware of what's going on around them and they're not able to follow the proceedings. So these are just some examples, and these are very kind of physical, emotional based. But if you think about the definition, going back to Samsa's definition, that broader definition, we want to also consider the social and the well-being aspects. And so we can see how those symptoms compounded can affect an individual's daily lives, relationships, their social status, and overall well-being and functioning. For example, social isolation. Trauma survivors might withdraw from engagements that they used to do, hanging out with friends or going out to dinner. And this can lead to future issues of feeling loneliness and depression. So you can see how it compounds. Other things that might result that affect our social well-being and general functioning include relationship strain. So trauma or the effects of trauma might cause people to not want to spend time or take a minute to, re-explain themselves or slow down the conversation. And so maybe people are like, oh, they can't track with me. And that's personal, right? But that relationship is also important in the courtroom. And so if you're finding that, oh, this individual, they're not tracking, they're not paying attention, and so you start getting short with them, that's a social effect of what trauma has done to that person, is that they're not engaging or having that relationship with other people because of other things that are going on in their life. So there's a lot of spaces that trauma can affect, not just social relationship, but also work and academic performance, and also increasing stigma or marginalization. So if this is related, if people don't want to talk to you or engage with you or be patient with you, then that can increase these other issues. So now we have a sense of what the effects of trauma are. I think it's important now to consider the prevalence of trauma. So we have learned the definition, right? And the definition for SAMHSA is this physical and psychological event that has a long-lasting negative effect on our social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So how often does this happen? What are we talking about? So we can look at the prevalence rates to better understand the impact of trauma more globally. And to start with, the World Mental Health Survey Consortium reports that 70% of the global population has experienced some form of trauma, such as violence, personal assault, or accidents. That's a lot of folks, 70%. That's pretty high. Notably, even more is that the exposure to interpersonal violence is associated with subsequent traumatic events, which means that if you've experienced interpersonal violence, the likeliness of you experiencing future violence or future traumatic events increases. So again, this is related to what we just talked about around the compounding effects of trauma, and how it increases risks as well as those negative effects. Similarly, according to the US National Stressful Events Survey, 89.7% of respondents reported exposure to trauma. So there's a variation in the numbers from these different surveys. So globally, it's saying it's 70%. But when we look more locally to the United States, it's actually higher. So 89% of folks are reporting exposure to trauma. And within that sample, so again, this is among US respondents, interpersonal violence was reported by 53.1%. So if we think back to that last notable bit, was that if you're exposed to interpersonal violence, you're more likely to experience subsequent traumatic events. So that's 53% of the US population as far as the prevalence of trauma. And then another data set from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey says that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced intimate partner violence, and 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men have experienced rape. So we can see just by looking at very general pop type prevalence rates that trauma is pretty common and a high likelihood among different people that we run into and come across in our daily lives. And we can make this kind of leap and hypothesis that for the criminal legal system, that rate is probably even higher. And I don't want to go into those numbers right now, because I think, one, you probably already have a sense that pretty much everybody you come in contact with has a history of trauma. And two, I think really understanding that it's a global as well as a national prevalence issue. We don't even need to get into highlighting that it's CLS involved or criminal legal system involved people that are experiencing trauma. Like separating that, to me, I feel like stigma of, you don't have to just be CLS involved to need, trauma informed responses. Everybody should be approached in that trauma informed response, because everybody has this high risk of experiencing trauma in today's environment. All right, so now that we have a pretty good sense of the definition, the effects, recognizing what trauma is, what it looks like, and also the prevalence, we can get into talking about the frameworks. So as I stated earlier, trauma-informed, this phrasing has been around for a while, and there's a lot of frameworks that have been developed around it. And people are running with the term, right? And so this is my call to let's slow down and talk about it and just make sure we're all on the same page whenever we're working with the framework, so that we do it really well and we do it in a way that's sustainable. So you can see here that trauma-informed has been attached to these various words, but I want to start first with the history. So if we understand the existing frameworks, we can start creating more sustainable, healing and empowering environments. But the history of trauma-informed care, so trauma-informed care is the phrase that kind of started the wave, so to speak. And it emerged from the healthcare sector. So this is medical field. These are doctors, nurses, emergency departments that were really starting to recognize the need for a new approach. And so the healthcare sector focuses, definition or approach to trauma-informed care focuses on creating safe, empowering, and healing environments for patients with trauma histories. So we'll see that repeated throughout: safe, empowering, and healing. Those are kind of key to, as we grow and build out this understanding of trauma, what trauma informed is. And so for the medical field, the aim was to adapt medical practices to recognize and respond appropriately to trauma and prevent re-traumatization. And so this comes up: re-traumatization is a big thing, right? How do I prevent re-traumatization? How do I avoid that? And this is one of those cans that I think needs to be unpacked and explored. But we can learn a bit from what this might mean when we reflect on what it was the medical field was doing. So just thinking about why would they need this approach? Why do medical professionals need to be trauma informed? So one example might be an individual that has a pretty serious injury or illness or disease. They go into the doctor's office to get care, but nobody makes eye contact, or nobody addresses them by their name. Nobody asks them how they're feeling, or if what their treatment is working, or if their pain is being managed. So the individual, instead of going into the medical professional's office and feeling cared for, feeling safe or empowered about their health, they feel ignored. They feel run through, just just a number on a piece of paper. Maybe they even just feel like a dollar bill, right? So, oh, the faster they can get me through, the more they can bill my insurance, or the more I have to pay out of pocket. So there's a lot of feelings that that individual is going through, and really, like, they have a medical need, but they're having all these other responses to the experience that they're having in the environment of the medical office. And so that, to me, is really the re-traumatization. So re-traumatization doesn't necessarily have to relate to the trauma that happened before. So it's not re-traumatization in that direct way of someone had a childhood traumatic experience. Re-traumatization isn't a redoing of that specific traumatic experience. It's more of like the emotions that happen to the individual in that medical office, where they feel unseen, unheard, they feel unimportant, and they don't feel safe. Those emotions are attached to prior trauma. And so they feel that in a way that their body ignites, and it brings it all to the forefront. And so one of the things that you might think is like, okay, well, what can a medical person do, right? The doctor needs to see other patients and needs to, prescribe medication, and the individual should just, abide by the doctor's orders, because the doctor knows best. But what they found was individuals who were needing medication or needing medical services, they started avoiding the medical office, or they weren't complying with their medicine protocol or their treatment protocol. And so it's not just that we don't want to re-traumatize, we also have this other desire, which is we want to be successful in our treatment. And so that's what the medical field was really looking to do. It's like, well, we know that the medicine will help them, but how do we get them to take the medicine? We know that we need to have them come in and check in with the doctor. What can we do to make that experience more likely that they'll come back again? And so you change your interactions, you change the environment. So recognizing that this was important, the trauma-informed care kind of policies, or not policies, but practices, I should say. Again, ensuring safe and empowering healing environments. So that's the first. And you can immediately see how just those three things would start to change the behaviors and the environment of the medical space. But then also we receive more guidance from, again, SAMHSA. They define trauma-informed care as practices that, starting with recognizing how common trauma is, which we've done. We just learned about the prevalence. learning to identify the signs of trauma, which we just reviewed, looking at the effects of trauma and really being able to recognize some of those symptoms, and then understanding its impact on behavior and health. And so seeing, again, we talked about how trauma might compound and affect our social well-being, our emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being, and we can start to really understand how much reach just a traumatic experience might have on an individual. So the next step from SAMHSA, who defines the trauma-informed care practices and also provides implementation guidance, says that we need to adapt our practices to avoid re-traumatization. So we can look to what the medical care system did as they started to change their environments, change their practices and their procedures to be more trauma informed, creating those safe and empowering and healing environments. So we can go a step further even to broaden the definition of informed care, again, looking at the work that comes out of SAMHSA and understand the principles of trauma-informed care. So we kind of understood a little bit of the steps and the implementation portion of it, but we can now have some principles. And again, in the resources, if you don't already have access to the principles of trauma-informed care, I will provide you the link to that document. But really, those are rested in safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment. So we talked that the original trauma-informed care definition really had that safety, that empowerment, and that healing environment. It was all about creating environment. But then we realized it's more than environment. It's also relationship. So you need to create these trustworthy, rapport-based relationships, and you got to maintain those relationships so that people come back to you, come back to the services, and those services succeed. They've also added this idea of choice. So a person who has choice or feels like they have choice, they're bought in, they're committed to the work that you're doing, whether that's for the medical field, work as far as maintaining or caring for a medical injury or a mental health treatment protocol. But also this makes sense in our space and in the courts and criminal legal system space. The next principle, collaboration, totally related to both choice and trustworthiness, right? You really want to emphasize that the individual has power in this space, and their engagement in the decision-making going forward is really what is going to make or break the success of whatever it is that you're working on. And this just bleeds right into the final principle, which is empowerment. So empowering individuals includes not only giving them the choice and collaborating with them, but if they don't have the skills to improve, then they'll keep repeating what got them in your office or your courtroom. And so you want to empower them with skills and creating alternative choices and options. So that is an important element to trauma-informed care. So I kind of already hinted at what the steps would be to implement trauma-informed care, but we are learning more and more about this. And again, the guide that SAMHSA provides also incorporates the importance and value of recognizing and respecting culture, historical, and gender issues. So people are not, they don't exist in a vat, right? We have so much richness to our lives that affect the way that we move through life. And so when someone is talking to you and they totally disregard that your family or your background or your community has an impact on who and what and why you are, then that conversation isn't going to go very far. So another recommendation that comes out of SAMHSA is to recognize and respect cultural, historical, and gender issues. We also want to, especially for courts that are nested within a cultural community, a culturally specific community, it is upon that court and the staff there to learn more about that. I think that is probably the bare minimum, really, is that every staff member and judge who isn't already a local member of that community should be doing their best to learn more and engage with that community. Relatedly, a step is to train staff to be aware and how to avoid re-traumatization. So you want to keep everybody educated. Make sure you're on the same page of the definition of the effects, recognizing the symptoms, and being training each other and learning from each other about what's working in your court and your procedures and what's not working in your court and procedures. It's really hard to give you like a specific do this because every court has their own process. Every court has their own flow. So this is the expectation that each court will reflect on their processes and consider how is this affecting the individuals we serve. And so that might be challenging. And sometimes it's hard to, right, see if you're a fish, does the fish know that it's in water, right? So that might be one of those situations. You're operating this courtroom and it seemed like you're nice to everybody, so you must be trauma informed, right? And so you don't really recognize what you're doing that might be triggering, might be harming. And so the next step that is recommended is to involve people with lived experience, or in other words, peers. Sometimes those folks, actually all the time, those folks, their voice to the table adds so much clarity to what is working and what isn't working, and what could really improve your system and your process. All right, so we've now reviewed some of the principles of trauma-informed care and the framework, really. And so now we can look even more closely at how this might be represented in our court systems and our criminal legal systems. So for safety, courts can ensure that the environment feels safe for all participants by addressing potential triggers and providing a supportive atmosphere. And this can start really early on, right? This can start as soon as people walk in the door at that security stage. I know from experience, and then also from hearing other people, sometimes the most traumatic part of going into court is that first part where you're like, what? I have to take off my belt. Oh, I'm not allowed to have my phone. And you have to like rush around to figure out what you can do. And to the extent that security staff are trained in that trauma informed, knowing the definition, recognizing the effects, anxiety, not following directions. Maybe they're like hyper worried they're going to be late. And so the security person is telling them, you have to remove your belt, you have to remove that. But the person isn't hearing it because they're having a trauma symptom. And so a trauma informed security person would be able to say, okay, slow down, you'll be okay. And then say, kind of demonstrate, take off your belt and then you can come in. So just slowing it down is a trauma-informed response to that situation. And then the next one, so courts for trustworthiness and transparency. Judges and court staff can maintain transparency in procedures and decision-making to build trust among participants. And this is being really clear about what the expectations of the court participation is and what the consequences of failing to meet those expectations are, and the pathways to be able to communicate when an anticipated violation might happen. So really communicating all those spaces so that a person can be more engaged and responsible, accountable for their participation. Again, peer support, and I'm sure you've already been educated on how valuable peers in the courts can be, where they can not only educate and inform on policy and recognizing what triggers might be there that we're not noticing, but they also provide support and guidance to individuals that are going through the process. Just having that person there in the room with you saying, I've done this before, you can do this before, this is what to expect next, you're okay, you're safe. And then other things courts can look at, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment and choice. These are all kind of so related to each other, but really engaging the individual as well as your colleagues in the treatment course. So that's the staff, that's the attorneys, if you have probation a part of it, and community as well. So engaging your community members to be part of informing how this court is going to work and how it's going to function. All right, so I'm going to jump forward and talk about what we're hoping to achieve, right? So what we're hoping to achieve with this trauma-informed framework, very much like what we talked about with the medical field, it wasn't just that they wanted to be nicer, right? It wasn't just about getting doctors to be more nice. It was also about having successful outcomes. And that's what it's about when we're talking about the courts. We want to have successful outcomes, better engagement, reduced re-traumatization, less recidivism, and just in general, more positive outcomes for the court. And so it's twofold. The one, totally valid goal, let's be nice to each other. But the other one is really kind of strategic and um, resource oriented, right? If we can be more successful in our court system outcomes, then that means we're going to see less of the same folks, and our resources won't be spread so thin because people will be successful in their lives and not in our court system. So adopting a trauma-informed framework for our judicial system is not just a compassionate approach, but it's a practical one. And hopefully we can see more about how and why that might be possible for us going forward. So moving us now to why. So I just kind of showed you, well, the what. What is trauma-informed care? How can it be translated to the court system? What are the benefits or the proposed benefits of having trauma-informed practices in my court? Well, I like to ask the question, why? I think it's really important because there's always going to be people that feel like, well, maybe this isn't what we should be doing. It's not the job or the obligation of the courts to be doing work this way. So I want to start first with really reflecting on what are our guidelines when we're working in the courts and in those legal spaces. And I don't have enough time to go into everybody's ethics, so I'm going to focus mostly on the professional ethics of judges. And so I'm reviewing and not in depth. You all probably know these rules and these guidelines much better than I do, but I do think that they're relevant to really orienting to why and maybe if we should be using trauma-informed practices in our courts. So judges are bound by several fundamental ethical duties, and we can look at the American Bar Association, so that's ABA, and the Model Code of Judicial Conduct. So these principles, there's definitions that are provided, but I think they're pretty self-explanatory. The first one, fairness. The next one, impartiality. So I put a little in my notes, I put a little asterisk next to that one because I immediately think, wait a minute, our trauma-informed practices just told us that we really needed to consider the history and the trauma and the emotional expression or physical expression of trauma. Isn't that something that might not be possible when we're called to be impartial? So put a little asterisk, let's think about that more. The next ethical duty is independence, integrity, transparency, respect for the law. Okay, so respect for the law. We need to abide by what the rules are in our procedures, in our sentencing, what our court rules are, what our statutes are. We need to respect that. And so that could potentially conflict. If our laws are maybe more punitive than what is called for through trauma-informed practice, maybe that's something that might put us in a jam, right, as a judge or as a court. So I put a little asterisk next to that one. The next one is competence. And I think that judges, both for trauma-informed practices as well as being a judge, you want to be capable and competent in the work that you're doing. So also there's some ethical obligations that come and provide guidance to judges. The first one is adherence to judicial codes of conduct. So avoidance of impropriety. So when you're out in the public, you want to not, be breaking the law, being intoxicated, and being improper, so to speak. And that retains the image and the respect for the court and for the profession itself. So those ones all make sense to me. They didn't seem to conflict so much with in trauma-informed practices. But the next one is confidentiality. And confidentiality, I put an asterisk against that because I was like, wait a minute, if we're screening for trauma history, if we're talking about trauma history of someone because we're trying to tailor or work with them around what their treatment plan is or what our response is going to be if they make a violation to one of the expectations, we might be in some warm water when it comes to that item of confidentiality. So asterisk next to that one, let's talk about it in a minute. The next three I felt like really coincide well with our trauma-informed principles. So those are diligence, accessibility, and respectful treatment. Respectful treatment, I seem like that's, one and one, right? They totally go in together. So in summary, I've identified a potential concern with the ethical duty for judges to be impartial, with the ethical duty of judges to be respectful of the law, and with the fundamental duty of judges to and courts to maintain the confidentiality. So the other items will just kind of reflect a little bit. I kind of said that I thought that these things were in alignment. So fairness was in alignment. You want respect for others. You want to be fair to others. That's in alignment with trauma-informed care. Integrity, that's in alignment. Independence and protecting the rights and dignity of individuals. I feel like that's in alignment. Transparency, clear and open communication, that's in alignment. And then let's see, so we already spoke diligence, handling issues promptly and attentively. I think that's in alignment, really respecting the individual's time and what's important to them, giving them space to present their case. Those all seem to go in alignment. So let's talk more about the potential conflicts. So potential conflicts, risk of bias and partiality, right? So there's a concern that weighing the effect of trauma on an individual might lead to bias or partial decisions that might compromise that value, that duty. So while we want to recognize that trauma is relevant, judges and the courts need to balance that with the principle of impartiality, and so that maintains that duty and obligation. So clearly, I think there is a concern here, and I've heard this from people, like, how can I maintain partiality? And so there's some recommendations, right? You take a balanced approach, integrate it into your procedures and process about how you're going to respond to particular instances. Have really clear procedures and protocols in place that everybody is aware of. That kind of helps to avoid that partiality. Yes, you've experienced trauma, and I know that you're having that effect, that trauma effect. You're agitated, you're confused, you're not sleeping well, you're really struggling right now. I see it. I recognize it, and I'm going to communicate to you what we're doing today. I'll repeat it if you need me. Do you need me to repeat it? And you just create that time, that safety of space, that safety for emotion and for healing. And so there is opportunity there that you could be at risk of partiality, but there's ways to protect against it. Again, I'll resay it. You want really clear procedures and protocols for your court. And you might need to revise these over and over just to really finesse them, because probably not going to get it right off the bat. And there's always new situations that you might not have foresaw before. Another way to avoid partiality or the perception of partiality is to really engage your team. So for treatment courts, really looking to get the input of everybody that's on your team, the attorneys, your clinicians, and the team members. That's really why it's a team member collaborative approach, so that there isn't one person that's being run by what they're experiencing and what they're seeing, but it's that collaborative approach can help with the risk of bias and impartiality. So another concern might be what I highlighted, or that asterisk that I put in our brains, was the needing to abide by the laws, right? So potentially we could conflict with some legal principles, or even just what is expected out of a particular sentencing or something like that. So one thing I think I recommend here is, this is, again, not just a slowdown for the individual, but a slowdown for the system. So it relates really to how I opened the conversation, which is trauma-informed practices has been a hot ticket item for a while now. And so everybody's creating these guidelines and these definitions and these principles and key components, and it's everywhere. And let's hurry up and do it. If you're not trauma-informed yet, where have you been all this time, kind of deal. But I think, like, this work takes time. And so if you're recognizing, if this is an issue for you where you're like, wow, as the law says this, I'm really not legally allowed to do this. And that would put me in trauma-informed compliance, right? And so my recommendation is what we need to do, that's a signal, right? That's the signal to slow down. Let's look more closely at our laws, at our policies, at our procedures, and right size them. Let's get them in alignment with making sure that they can do what we need to so you don't violate what those asks are. And I think to me, it really is about slowing down and taking the time to make those revisions. And there's a lot of models out there for communities and courts that have done the work to like make their procedures more trauma informed. And there's guidance out there to do it. All right, so the next concern that might happen, and this wasn't actually a part of the codes of conduct or the duties, but it's more like just kind of a global recognition that this might be a challenge. And I think it's related to the last topic, which is so resource and capacity issues. So this rush and this pressure to be trauma informed yesterday is like, wait a minute, we are understaffed, we're underfunded. Where am I going to find the time or the person to revise all of our procedures? We're working really tightly right now. So again, I think recognizing these limitations for your court, for your community, should be an opportunity for you to take a breath and be like, yeah, we're not trauma informed yet, but we're going to get there. And we're starting first with thinking about our resources, our capacity. We're going to consider and look at other models of procedures and policy. And we're going to move thoughtfully and intentionally towards trauma informed practices. But maybe it's not going to be achieved overnight. And then finally, the last concern that I had highlighted, and one of those duties or obligations that courts and judges have, is confidentiality, right? So with the work that we do in trauma-informed courts, screening and sharing trauma histories, very clearly this is at risk of violating confidentiality and at risk of violating that ethical obligation. So what can we do? I think it loops back into what we've talked about. We need to be really clear about how we're going to store that information, what it's going to be used for, if it's going to be destroyed afterwards or saved afterwards, and clear, strict protocols about how that information is saved or shared with others. Also, implementing really robust consent procedures. So if you're going to do a screening, you have a consent process where individuals consent to that information being collected and used to inform how the court is going to engage with them, how the staff is going to engage with them. And that's something that you can get more education on and work to build. But again, not an overnight process, there's not an overnight solution to this complication, but it is a legitimate concern, right? It means, why should treatment courts be informed? And to me, I feel like, yeah, okay, we've kind of established why they should, but in some cases, it's they're not really ready yet, if they can, right? So we're slowly moving towards that state, and you need to lay the groundwork first. So to really respond to that concern, which is totally legitimate, but the concern about confidentiality, I think, gets raised a lot, and the solutions there are having protocols that protect information, and making sure that there's a consent process and communicating what's going to happen with that information, how it's going to be used, and just really aligning it with your other processes and procedures, and educating all your staff on confidentiality practices. Okay, so that was a lot, right? That we just went through just the real ethics of judges in the courts. And to me, I feel like that was enough to be able to recognize that there's a little wiggle room in there. Like, it's not an instant, yes, all treatment courts should be trauma informed and they should be doing it yesterday. I think it's all a journey, it's a process, and it takes thoughtful consideration to implementing this work. And it's not going to happen overnight. So, but we can look at other court structures, court models, about the places where it's already existing. It's already in alignment, right? So right off the bat, 10 key components of drug courts, and this is the components of other treatment courts. It's kind of been expanded and integrated into other forms of these courts, but we can see how some trauma-informed practices are easy to implement. We can do it today, whereas some of those other issues, the law alignment, the confidentiality concerns, impartiality, risk, those things might take some thinking. They might take some thought. But there are other places where trauma-informed practices can be pretty instantaneously integrated. So thinking about the 10 key components of drug courts, they already are doing a lot of this work, and I think that goes the same for healing to wellness courts as well, which I'll get into. But integrating treatment into the court process, having a non-adversarial approach, so it's very collaborative, identifying individuals' needs and connecting them to the services that they need. So it's very much tailored to individuals, creating that access to treatment, coordinating strategy. So having other folks that might be informed about what could be helpful to the individual to make a plan, having the judge be trained in working with an individual. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with motivational interviewing, but that can really help that process of engagement and creating that motivation in the individual to engage, whether it's engaging in treatment or engaging in other parts of the program. Ongoing training for all the staff, and engage in the community in the work. So just based on these 10 components that come from the drug court model, we can see that, in a lot of ways, our treatment courts, our drug courts, our healing to wellness courts are already doing the work to integrate trauma-informed practices. So the benefits here that we see is, again, back to why this all started. Why are we trying to be trauma-informed in any way? It's not just because we want to be nicer to people. It's also because we want better outcomes, reduced recidivism, our better, safe communities. So reducing the crime and other dangerousness in our community. Also, the positive ripple effect. So healthier people, they create a healthier community, and we all benefit from that, right? So create opportunities and environments that are healthy, we have that positive ripple effect. So a little bit more about other examples or ways that this can be integrated. So thinking about healing to wellness courts and how I think it's pretty much innate. Like if you're operating a healing to wellness court and you're reading your key components, you can kind of already see, wow, this seems to really jive with the trauma-informed practices or trauma-informed care. So starting first with an orientation around community healing, and recognizing that it's the community that kind of brings together this wellness and both physical and spiritual healing, not just for the individual, but the community at large. And then really recognizing and respecting the dignity of the individual. So looking to create process that supports and protects the rights, dignity, and due process of the individual. Other ones very similar to drug court components, identifying individuals early so that you can connect them to services that will be helpful. Having a holistic treatment option and plan. So not just considering the local focused issue, maybe it's substance use issues, but really thinking global or holistic. Maybe the individual wants to engage in spiritual healing as well as their substance use treatment, and creating opportunities for that. So we could go on, but I do think that there's a lot of ways that this overlaps, right? And let's see. Just realized I'm behind on time, so I'm gonna move quickly here. So let's move to the steps real quick. So we saw the better outcomes, right? I'm just going to click through those, but definitely looking to have better outcomes for individuals and better outcomes for the community. So now that we've had that conversation of should and if and how, let's should, if, and now we'll move to how. So the steps to becoming trauma informed, and we kind of been like laying it on, layering it on, but there's a lot of resources out there for how courts can become trauma informed. And we get guidance again from the few documents from SAMHSA, one of them being the concept of trauma and guidance for trauma informed approach. I find this document to be super helpful. It organizes trauma informed practices in domains. And so you can kind of chunk out where are we going to work first. And this relates to what those conflicts were, right? We need to identify what level should we be working at today so that down the line, eventually we'll have that trauma informed practice. And for me, I organize it in 4 domains. So I have strategy, which includes the governance and leadership policy. And then I have operations, which sometimes I think operations comes first, especially if you're having issues with being concerned about confidentiality, having concerns about not being demonstrating partiality, or having concerns about violations of current law. So working out your existing operations. How does screening happen? Where does the information from screening go? And then really training up folks and staff on your team on the definition of trauma that you're going to be running with, how to recognize the effects of trauma, both not only behavioral and physical, but also that social compounding effects of trauma, how it kind of that domino effect, how it can affect relationships or responses to particular situations, environment. The next like higher level domain category is execution. And this one I think is probably the next space that I would work in. So according to SAMHSA's concept, these domains are physical environment, engagement and involvement, and cross-sector collaboration. This to me, I think, is bringing that peer in the space, in the room, or the person with lived experience, letting them inform on how the room can be, the space can be more trauma informed, what the triggers are. And then also in that same breath, you're engaging the community, you're engaging your experts that are outside of the court system to inform what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then finally, the remaining domains are progress monitoring, quality assurance, evaluation, and financing. And to me, I put those in the category of sustainability. So I think you want to think about those things because they're important to making sure that your court is going to be sustainable. Your trauma-informed court is going to be sustainable because you want to be able to see the effect, the outcomes. That's really what the whole point is, right? At least a large part of it is that you want to see positive outcomes of your court in that improvement. So sustainability is an important step. Again, you can look more and access SAMHSA's concept of trauma and guidance for trauma-informed approach online. It's freely accessible. So accordingly, just more simply, we can look at starting with finding a healing model that is congruent with community court team values. So this, I think, is sometimes a first step, because if your staff comes from a different culture than your judge, and your lawyers and your attorneys, your attorneys come from a different culture, or your jail staff, you need to all get on the same page about what it is you're trying to achieve in your court. And that might just be the first thing that you do, is identifying that healing model. And there is an example, so I have it posted here on the screen, but it comes from the Aleut community of St. Paul Island. And I thought it was really helpful in describing what that community's healing model was, and really came out of the hard work of reflecting what the community wanted to achieve through their court. So I would recommend it as a model to look at. And so some of the values that they highlighted in their handbook here is that they want to prioritize relationships and incorporate that as a high focus. They want to have tradition being a centering part of the work that they do in their court. Spirituality is really important to what they do in their court. Fostering resilience and highlighting the resilience of their participants was something they wanted to do. They also wanted to create space and opportunity for individuals to develop strong positive identity as it related to who they are in the community. Accountability, so encouraging responsibility and accountability in the individuals. So it's not just this one side of let's get you healthy, but let's also show you how your behaviors and your actions affect the rest of us, and really encouraging responsibility and accountability. They also have this tribal value of holistic approach. So they want to have all aspects of well-being incorporated into their court process. And so they don't want to just limit it to whatever specific topic, whether that's substance use or mental health, but they want all aspects of well-being, physical, spiritual, uh, social. All these aspects of well-being are considered and supported in the court. They also have other elements, including contribution. So giving back to the community is part of the work that participants do. And then balance was another principle that they provided in their book. So I would highly recommend this model if you're looking to try and orient or create your own healing model. And even though we just talked about SAMHSA's guide and their domain and all those domains, and sometimes that's super conceptual. It's very process heavy. And if you get too much in the process before you've started with the people, I think you already sustainability is already less likely. So my recommendation is start first with the people, get on the same page about your definition of trauma, your goals for the court, what you're hoping to achieve, and then start integrating and aligning those values, those goals with what it means to be trauma informed. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up with being able to identify some trauma related triggers. Oops. And some kind of basic fixes, I guess, starter fixes that I think are the ones that maybe won't take, all that work of process and stuff, but stuff that maybe you're already doing or would be really easy to implement. So the first one, identifying trauma related triggers. I think this is really important because if your environment is unsafe, then that's something that you should pretty much change right away. That could be how you get into the courtroom, if it's overly complicated, if it's threatening or scary, if the staff aren't welcoming or if they're rude even. Those are clearly things that you can train and you can remove or adjust. And then procedures. So we've talked about some of those procedures that might need to be rewritten, but there's other ways to adjust. You can adjust your language. So using, and I know we talked about being more culturally informed, but even using a person's chosen or preferred name can really change an interaction and demonstrate that you see the individual and you respect the individual. Excuse me. Also, the being more flexible in scheduling. So if you're in a particular community and they have a holiday or a recognized day or an event, that might need to be adjusted, or even just more personal. So recognizing that each of the participants in your court is an adult, or maybe this is a juvenile that you're working with, but this is a person, this is a human being, and they have connections and families and a life outside of this courtroom. And yes, the courtroom does deserve some level of respect and that the person should defer a little bit, right? We have these processes and that they're there for a reason, but at the same time being flexible and recognizing that individuals have life and have lives that they're living, and maybe they're not going to be able to make a particular meeting. And so giving them a pathway to be able to communicate that. Last minute, I wasn't able to get childcare and I'm not going to be able to make it. Is there a Zoom line that I can hop on instead? Or can we reschedule it? Or can you give me 5 minutes before, like, to drop off at my mother's? Being a little bit flexible and communicating that flexibility. Call this number if you're not going to make your appointed time, and we'll either shift you to a Zoom meeting or we'll reschedule you. Something like that. That can be pretty simply implemented. All right, so that was quite a bit, and I definitely think I went over on time. Last thing I'm going to just say is what particular folks within the court can do. So recommendations for judges. You can demonstrate commitment to providing trauma-informed care by changing your language, learning and being trained in this work. You're a leader in the space. So a lot of this comes from the judges. Court coordinators, they have so much on their plate, and I know that this is a real challenge to find a way to implement trauma-informed procedures and policy. But really, there is models and there's support for you, but that does fall on the court coordinator to really start reflecting on what your procedures and your mission even is for the court. Treatment providers, they should be using validated assessments and be thoughtful about how those assessments are provided and that individuals are informed about where the information is going and who has access to that. And then, of course, the attorneys, they should also be receiving trauma. They should be on the same page about the definition, on the same page about what the goals are of the court so that they can do their job within their set of professional ethics in an alignment with the goals of the court and together be trauma informed. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. So I'm gonna, oops. Let's see. I just lost everyone.
We can still see you, Dr. Cloud.
Okay.
There
Sorry.
we go.
Okay.
That's okay.
Sorry.
So we have just a few minutes, Dr. Cloud, if you would accept any questions, if anybody has any.
Yes, please,
okay.
please.
Okay. So there is a Q&A box if you want to enter questions that you may have, something to follow up with Dr. Cloud, and we'll just give a few minutes for that. But while we wait for some questions, Dr. Cloud, I just wanted to thank you for those quick recommendations of, quick things we can start doing to make a court environment more trauma-informed, with those quick fixes of signs or lighting or the feeling of safety. And I thought it was so helpful and interesting for your comment about starting with the operational part or the people of the court, because essentially this is who carries out the daily work, and see the benefit in it starting with the experts, the people who are actually providing direct services, and then having it grow from there. As we know, with tribal courts or even healing to wellness courts, those operational manuals are living documents, or should be. They shouldn't just be on a shelf, right? So really reflecting in operational manuals how the daily work is being done. And that would be maybe a first step to putting it into policy, or the structure part that you were mentioning to us. Any questions? I'll give it a little more time in case someone's in the middle of typing.
Yeah, while we wait, I have just a couple more thoughts.
Sure.
Again, I didn't show the slide, but there is a slide of resources. So if there's request for the resource list as well as my notes, everything that I just spoke on, I have an outline and I'm happy to share it with folks. And then I also have this thought of, for treatment courts, mental health courts, we come in contact, even just kind of when I first started, we come in contact with so much trauma. And there's such a risk of secondary trauma, or kind of that vicarious trauma, even just hearing what people have to go through just to get to court, or maybe they're trying to describe like how they became where they're at, right? If they're substance use addicted, maybe it started at a really young age, and all these things, and you hear that and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine my niece going through that, my mother going through that, my father or me going through that. And we have that vicarious trauma. To me, I feel like all of this work, parallel to this work, as you're going through it, and it's a lot of work. Some of this, especially changing your policies and procedures, can be really labor intensive, really for, I think, our court coordinators, right? They are the champions of the court. They get things done. Yeah. They really drive that. And so providing support to your court coordinators to have that self-care, take time for yourself to make sure that you're able to sustain being trauma informed, right? And I had mentioned that security, they go through, like the court security, they might be going through a lot that day. Maybe they've had 15 people come through the door and every single one of them gave them trouble. They all had their phone, or they all refused to lose their belt. And so by that time, the security person they're lit up, right? Their body, their emotions, they're all lit up. So being able to recognize when your own body is lighting up, when your patience and compassion is burnt out, and taking a minute and being like, I actually don't have the capacity to be trauma informed right now for you because I'm struggling to be trauma informed for myself. And that's a whole different conversation, right? But I think it's really relevant to this work.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cloud. I just wanted to ask if you had a minute to please scan the QR code that's on the screen to evaluate our webinar here today. And Chelsea also put a link in the chat box if you'd like to click on that link to complete the presentation. I'll give that a minute. And that would complete today's webinar. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. As I mentioned when we first started, we still have 2 up and coming webinars for the next 2 Thursdays in the month of May. And you can find a recording of this webinar on the wellnesscourts.org site in just a few days once we can get that posted. But thank you everybody for your time today. And thank you, Dr. Cloud, for your presentation and your wisdom that you shared with us today. Have a great afternoon, everybody.